Welcome to episode 4 of Game of Thrones Abridged. We are now up to the chapter called Daenerys 1, A Game of Thrones. We cross a continent here. We cross a sea to Essos. The fact that Essos rhymes with across, or almost, is a gift to Game of Thrones rappers everywhere. And so this chapter, our introduction to Daenerys Targaryen, begins with mention of a wedding. Fear and barbaric splendor is the phrase with which this wedding is described, which is rather a good phrase. And we have a little bit of description of the Dothraki. We talk about Drogo and his Khalasar, his warriors and his followers, and the power of this man, Khal Drogo. Of course, this is a textual medium, Game of Thrones, the book. Game of Thrones, the show, needs only to show you Khal Drogo's pecs, and then you know exactly the extent of Khal Drogo's power. But in the books, we must rely on words, and so words are spent by George Martin to describe Khal Drogo's power. And so we also have mention of Magister Illyrio, who was rather underdone in the show. We didn't see much of Illyrio, even though in the books, Magister Illyrio is one of the most sort of interesting, fascinating, intriguing characters in the show, in the books, honestly. But in any case, we get a description of a meal, because this is the Game of Thrones books after all. Honey duck and orange snap peppers and grease running down chins and such, whatever, we can skip that. And so there's next Ser Jorah Mormont joking about the marriage between Daenerys and Drogo. So things are actually moving surprisingly quickly in the books. I think this is actually faster than what happens in the show. In the show, you've got about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes of Viserys sort of incestuously stroking his naked sister. So you gotta suffer through that before you actually sort of get anywhere. In the books, we've already established that there's a wedding, and here are the principal characters, and let's get on with it. So hey, D&D, blame them. So anyway, so Illyrio's hanging out, and Viserys says, like, oh, you know, I want to be fucking king. This is Dany's brother, Viserys, and Viserys is like, I want to be king, and Illyrio says, you will be king, because Drogo is gonna make you king. And Viserys is a cunt is established pretty quickly. He says he pisses on Dothraki omens. He complains that he doesn't have his crown yet. He wants it back from Robert Baratheon, who took his throne from him in Robert's Rebellion. And there's bristling, and there's guarding of tongues, and there's enigmatic tearings of wings from ducks. George Martin loves using food as a way of illustrating character. And yes, indeed, there is honey and grease running over fingers and dripping down into beards. Wonderful. Daenerys, meanwhile, is the point of view character, and she's sort of observing all of this passively. Of course, Daenerys' arc kind of has her begin as this very sort of this very passive, meek character who doesn't really sort of do much and is a pawn of her brother and of Illyrio, but gradually becomes a powerful, assertive character in her own right, perhaps too much so when she starts burning cunts. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So yes, speaking of waking dragons, because we mention a dream that Daenerys has, in which Viserys is being a dick, attacking Daenerys, and Daenerys' thighs are slick with blood, and there's a dragon. Daenerys dreams of a dragon. This is a hashtag dragon dream, which foreshadows the birth of hatching of Daenerys' dragons later on in this very book. But hey, that's a spoiler. And so there's speak of the ceremony, drinking and feasting and fighting, blah, blah, fucking blah. And Daenerys talks about how alone she feels, and it sucks to be her. There's also thick black sausages and Dothraki blood pies, more food. And she feels alienated because she doesn't speak the Dothraki language. She only speaks the common tongue of Westeros, which the Dothraki don't speak. So she's going into a really terrifyingly alien situation by marrying Drogo, but she reminds herself that she's the blood of the dragon, that she's a Targaryen, so she need not fear anything. That's what she tells herself. But, she's hearing all these rumors about what the Dothraki are like. They say that the Dothraki fuck women like horses do, and that the Dothraki are barbarians, and the Dothraki are terrible. And Dany seems to think that too. So again, it's a little bit like the wildling situation back in the other chapter, like how, we're told that wildlings are like these savages and these barbarians who drink blood from human skulls and stuff. But later on in the story, we find out that, well, they're not a homogenous people, and they're not all cunts. Some of them are human beings. In fact, all human beings are human beings, and people have complex characters, and that's, again, one of the beautiful, great humanizing aspects of A Song of Ice and Fire in George Martin's writing. But anyway, yes, and we have that nice line about how a Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a dull affair, which is fun. And so the Dothraki are sort of fucking around, and Drogo's being sort of Drogo. We get the handmaidens. Viserys gifts Dany with 3 handmaidens, Irri and Jiqui, and Doria. Who, they actually kind of do stuff in the show which they don't do in the books. In the show, I think it's Doria betrays Dany by hooking up with Zarazo and Daxos in Karth. And there's actually this scene where Irri and Doria, I think, are sort of hanging out. And I think Doria kills Irri in this deleted scene of the Game of Thrones show, which I think never made it into the actual show because it was kind of terribly acted. But it was kind of interesting how they gave actual roles to these characters, whereas in the books, I don't think they do all that much. Although I think they do survive longer. In any case, Jorah gives some books to Dany, and Illyrio gives dragon eggs, which remains one of the more puzzling parts of this series. Why did Illyrio give Dany something so valuable? Like, even if Illyrio didn't know that dragon eggs could be hatched into actual fucking dragons, which are impossibly valuable, and which Illyrio presumably would have liked to have held on to for Aegon, who he's actually supporting throughout all this nonsense. Even if he didn't know that, I mean, why give something so valuable to Dany? Why not just use those 3 dragon eggs to buy a bunch of armies to support Aegon or whatever, I think this whole sort of situation is like a relic of George Martin's like earlier thought of the series, which remained unedited and survived into the final books. There's all sorts of stuff like that in the books, which was clearly sort of like one of these cool original ideas, but which doesn't actually really fit into the later situations in the books. In any case, so she's got dragon eggs, which is super dope, and she's got other presents from lots of other people, and Khal Drogo gives her a silver horse, which survives into the current book, into Dance of Dragons. Barristan rides it into the Siege of Meereen. In the show, they had the horse briefly, but then it just sort of fucking disappeared, if I recall correctly. I don't think they actually show what happens to the horse. Does it die in the Red Waste? I don't fucking know. Anyway, so mounts the horse, and it's sort of, I think she goes off on the horse, which sort of symbolizes her being sort of taken off by the Dothraki. It's crossing the veil to a new part of her life, the Dothraki part of her life. And she's about to have sex with Drogo, which is terrifying for her, because, yeah, she's like a child as well, basically, isn't she? I can't remember what age she is, but she's rather young, and she's having sex with Drogo, which is, by the sound of it, not a great time for her, but yeah, no, his fingers were deft and strangely tender, so you've got to give him that. In any case, this is a long sex description. Lots of massaging and knuckles down spines, thumbs and forefingers and nipples. Man, I wish I could get the face of George Martin out of my head when I was reading this. Oh, and there you go, the final line of that chapter is, yes, she whispered, as she put his fingers inside her. So, I mean, make of that what you will. It is a child having sex with an adult barbarian warlord man who was given her in a pact for war. Whether you want to call that a confronting depiction of the harsh realities of medieval society, or if you want to call that a somewhat creepy genius writer old man indulging in his interest in uncomfortable sexual situations, that's up for you to decide. But in any case, we've just been introduced to Daenerys. We've had our first chapter in Essos, we've had our first introduction to Daenerys and the Dothraki, and it's a nice reminder of how much Daenerys' character has changed. She started as like this meek little kid, and now she's become this fucking all-powerful mother of dragons, queen of marine motherfucker, right? She's hard. Which is an even more impactful transformation in the books, I would say. I mean, not to demean the show, but the show, like, you're only with the characters for so many hours. In the books, you see their whole fucking story. Admittedly, this abridged series kind of takes away that entire point that I'm making, but nonetheless, we have finished the 4th episode of this Game of Thrones abridged series. If you'd like to see episode 5, press all of the buttons, and I will see you next time.